big trial in Georgia for election integrity, specifically as whether or not two new rules issued by the Georgia Election Board, MAGA members, is valid under state law. We saw the bench trial where that was at issue. The two election rules that are being specifically discussed are the ones adding reasonable inquiry as a standard to the county election officials before they certify. And the second, as they're allowing them to request any and all documents before certification. Essentially what happened here is the plaintiffs is the Democratic National Committee, the Georgia Democratic Party, some voters in Georgia and superintendents in Georgia asking the judge for declaratory relief, which means they're asking the judge to clarify and say what the law is. Because what is at issue is that the Georgia Election Board is an agency, and as an agency, it cannot create election laws. State has election laws. What they do as an agency is create rules that will help basically give guidance to election officials as to how to carry out state law. And the plaintiffs in this case, the DNC and the superintendents and the voters, are saying that these rules go beyond state law. It's giving them authority and power that's not specified in state law. And because of that, we are asking you, Judge, to say that, to say what this rule actually means, to give guidance. And what is at issue here is not, money. They're not asking for money. They're not asking for an injunction. They're not asking for him to, overturn the rules, but to interpret them and to give the law specifically. What does that mean? If there is a reasonable inquiry, and if that comes against state law, then how are they supposed to reconcile that as the superintendents? And the defendants, the Georgia Election Board MAGA members, as we know, these MAGA members took over control of the Georgia Election Board this past year. It became a 3-2 majority, and Trump even called them out on the rally. And they've been doing a lot of rules, and I'll talk some more about even the rule that they just recently did about the hand count and the suit against Georgia Kemp. There's a lot happening in Georgia. I'll talk about that at the end here. So first, just to get to this bench trial, because this has been going on for a few weeks. The judge had this bench trial to hear all the issues. He's going to decide essentially whether or not this is lawful or not, what the Georgia Election Board did. What the Georgia Election Board is trying to say, though, is, a few arguments they're trying to say. One is standing. They're trying to say none of these plaintiffs have standing. So, Judge, you shouldn't even get to the substantive question of whether or not this is lawful or not. The judge, I think, really, and there's also really something interesting about the judge. I'll kind of tell you about a little bit at the end as well. We're seeing him a lot in the news right now. But the judge essentially said, the one party out of all the parties where that makes the most sense is the superintendents, because the superintendents, need to know how to carry out their job. But it is true that the Georgia Election Board is also saying, they're just asking for an advisory opinion because there's been no harm. And it is true that courts are not supposed to make decisions if there's been no harm, essentially, because the purpose of our justice system is to go to court because you don't have hypotheticals like this is what happened. Address what happened. And so there's a tension between a declaratory judgment because they're asking for a judge to decide the law, but they're not really saying yet that anybody has been harmed because, they haven't yet had to certify the vote. They haven't yet had to try out these new rules. So there's always a tension between whether or not an opinion is going to be declaratory or an opinion or a advisory opinion. So the Georgia Election Board trying to say, this is just an advisory opinion. This is too soon. If this is a problem, they can come into court. If this doesn't get certified and this gets delayed, then they can come into court then. Never mind you'd have to detachment from reality that if this is really the case, right now, Georgia law says that they have to certify. There's no wiggle room. They have to certify by the Monday after the election by, I think, 5 p.m. They have to do it. If they find any fraud, what they're supposed to do is send it to the DA's office or they can contest an election through the court. They do have mechanisms, but they themselves have to certify it no matter what, because their whole role is to really only count whether or not the math is done correctly, the tabulation is done correctly. They're not supposed to go into whether or not, the whole hanging chads or anything like that. It's really, was it counted correctly? And so to the extent, let's say there's 800,000 registered voters and there ends up being 810,000 ballots, there's a mismatch. What they would do, though, is still certify the vote, and then they would send that evidence to the DA or to the courts, because they're not supposed to police themselves. That in itself is undemocratic. So the idea that this Georgia election board is giving these county officials these like extra tools that the state law don't have, like what's the purpose? Because they're not supposed to be the ones to like find this, find out what happened. Like that would be the DA's office or the court's office. So that's why the superintendents and the DNC and the Georgia Election Board are like, this is really just about delaying or stopping the certification of the vote. Like this is very clear. This is what it's about. Getting beyond standing, getting beyond the fact of whether or not we should wait until they don't certify to file a suit. I mean, the chaos that would involve if they don't certify, Georgia doesn't certify and it gets delayed. And, what do we do at a national level? Just not have a state, submit their certification and their votes, like the chaos would be involved. And frankly, the narrative, because at that point it would be, oh, the courts are, stopping the inquiry, right? Like that would be the narrative that Trump and his MAGA would say, that they were stopping the investigation, even though the investigation is supposed to happen at this court level or the DA level. That's where the investigation is supposed to start. But, that would be the narrative. And so we know like that's the purpose of this, is to give them a little bit of like legal cover with these new rules to delay or stop the certification. And then if the courts force it, then the narrative becomes, oh, they're stopping the certification. So this is why the DNC and the Georgia Election Board, the superintendents, are trying to get ahead of it and say, hey, the superintendents, if nobody else, the superintendents need to know in advance how to do their job. Like you need to tell us so we know how to allocate resources. We need to know if fellow, board members don't certify, like what do we do in that respect? Like we need guidance from the court. And it was interesting because the Georgia Election Board lawyer was trying to argue to the judge, hey, like this isn't about bad faith actors delaying certification. Like, we can't just in a hypothetical think that this was about. And the judge said, well, my county had an election member not certify the vote. And this is the reality, right? Like we see in the echo chambers of Fox News, they can make their own lies about stuff, but she was trying to lie to the judge, like, hey, like no one's going to use this to delay it. And he's like, well, actually that happened to me. And this is where sometimes the law can be so satisfying, because they have to, you can't lie in the same way as you can to a judge as you can on a TV camera. Okay. So so the judge basically is having to decide whether or not do the parties have standing. He seemed to think, if nothing else, the superintendents did, is declaratory judgment possible in this case. And if he decides yes, especially to the superintendent, then he goes to whether or not reasonable inquiry and whether or not this request for all documents is against the state law. And the reasonable inquiry phrase really seemed to bother him the most. He was like, this is vague. It's very vague. And the vagueness of it could be contrary to state law. That seemed to bother the judge the most. Now, one other interesting element in this case is there is a Supreme Court opinion, Purcell, that says courts shouldn't ever overturn or have any decision around election rules or laws so close to the election, because you don't want a court to decide, frankly, our rules around elections. And so the Georgia Election Board is trying to say this to the judge. Judge, you shouldn't even touch this because it is too close to the election. So you don't get to decide this. And I thought the judge gave like the perfect response to that by saying, but if you have this unelected body with this agency, the Georgia Election Board, they're not the legislature. They can't create law. If you have this unelected body promulgating rules that essentially change the way we run elections, and then you don't allow any court oversight, like that can't be right, right? So that is what they're trying to do, right? They want to try to change election law so close to the election and then point to the courts and say, hey, you can't do anything about it because the Supreme Court said this years ago. And the fact is, what would happen is you would have no oversight whatsoever because these are unelected officials, and then you wouldn't allow the court to do it. And Judge McBurney really pushed back on that, and I thought in a good way. And who he is, he just decided the abortion issue. He was the judge that ruled that the 6-week abortion ban in Georgia was unconstitutional under the state constitution. He just ruled that. And then the next day is doing this bench trial on this really important election issue. And interestingly, he was also the judge who oversaw the grand jury when they were collecting evidence that ultimately resulted in the indictment of Trump with the RICO charges in Georgia. So he has been in the middle of quite a lot of important issues in Georgia. And if you're wondering, yes, he was appointed not by a Democrat, but by a Republican governor. Back in the day when Republicans appointed, well thought out judges, and not just because they were towing some sort of extremist party line. So that is what's happening in Georgia. In terms of the bench trial, we're going to wait and hear what he has to say. And then also we saw that they just put out another rule, Georgia Election Board. They are not stopping. This lawsuit did not slow them down. They're then requiring hand counts of ballots in Georgia, which, as you know, with certain counties, talk about delay. This is all about delay and chaos and trying to create confusion and distrust around elections. Certainly hand counting ballots in really populous counties like Fulton County would take so long. And this is what they're looking for. They're looking for some legal cover to create the distrust and the chaos and the delay. So the DNC has sued for that as well. And I think depending on what opinion we get in this case will be very determinative of whether or not that hand count rule will go forward as well. Also, interestingly, is what's happening is the Governor Kemp is being sued because, I mentioned that there's 3 MAGA appointees on the court, and Trump calling out one of them by name at the rally, Janice Johnston. She showed up. He called her out by name. And that in itself was an ethical violation because they're not supposed to be involved in anything partisan. This is technically supposed to be a nonpartisan board. There was a Republican who had been on the board before and was voting against their really extremist thing, and they pushed him out. So this is clearly becoming partisan, even though it's not partisan. Them showing up at the rally was an ethical violation. But Governor Kemp hasn't started any ethical, he's supposed to be scheduling hearings in order to hear about the ethical complaints against those 3 Georgia board members. And he hasn't yet started that hearing. And so there's a lawsuit against him to push him to do that as well. The Secretary of State, the Republican Secretary of State, has come out and is against these Georgia board election rulings. So we're really talking about MAGA. We're talking about Trump wanting to stop the certification post-election, calling Governor Kemp post-election, trying to come up with the votes, and then trying to do it before the election this time around, trying to give them some legal cover. So we see here a really important case with the DNC and the Georgia Democratic Party and the voters of Georgia and the superintendents of Georgia asking this judge, who's a really well-reasoned judge, help us not to have the chaos. Help us to not be giving legal cover for these election officials to not certify or to delay the certification. Don't give this agency more power than they were given by the people of Georgia.
Love this video? Make sure you stay up to date on the latest breaking news and all things Meidas by signing up to the MeidasTouch newsletter at MeidasTouch.com/newsletter.